As we get to the end of the year, it's time to reflect, time to go back and look at all the things that we liked and disliked over the year. So, with that in mind, I'm going to start my collection of lists, compiling the things I really did like and really didn't like over the year, starting with one of my favourite things, music. This week we're going to be looking at the best and worst albums of the year, according to Lil Homme Moi. Luckily this year's been pretty good for music, I've got to say overall. I liked most things, and really I think it was kind of hard to find a lot of things I didn't like over this year. It was mostly a year of really great albums and a couple of average ones, but there were a few I wasn't that keen on. So with that all said, this week we're going to look at the best and worst albums of 2024. Alright, starting off, we're going to start off with the worst, because I'd rather start off with the bad and go into the good. And again, like I said before, preface it, there really wasn't that many bad albums this year. And again, I think even these bad albums we're looking at right now, bar one, I gotta say overall, it's mostly just stuff that I just didn't really care for, rather than stuff that I thought was outright, awful. Number 3, GNX by Kendrick Lamar. God, people are gonna hate me for this one. Sadly, I just really did not care for this album, but to be honest, this is more of a me thing because I haven't really cared for a Kendrick album since To Pimp a Butterfly. While I praise him for trying to do new things with each album he releases, I just really am not into these weird vocal inflections he keeps doing on these new songs, and this album is more full of it than any of his previous releases. He just keeps doing these odd vocals that sounds like he sat on something really pointy by mistake, and especially on some of the slower, more melodic songs on the album, such as Luther, his vocals almost ruin the song with how little they match the beat, and even just the vibe of the song overall. And I feel in general this album has the same issue as all of his post To Pimp a Butterfly releases, where the beats really just aren't that interesting, and honestly I could see any other rapper rapping over them, and I think it would probably sound better considering just how weird he tries to do his vocals over the beat, which just does not combine. Lyrically, the album's fine, but nothing really stands out other than Reincarnated, where he sings lyrically from the perspective of many black artists throughout history, which again I thought was pretty interesting, but it's the only one I can really say that did stand out to me. The only other two songs I like are Luther and Gloria, but that's mostly because SZA features on them, and I love her voice, it's so great, and it really makes me forget how bad Kendrick's rapping is on this project. And there's this one song near the end called GNX, which has a beat that sounds like one of those worst beat ever created videos, and Kendrick's weird yelled rapping on top of it made it pretty much unlistenable. I had to just end up skipping this song. A pretty bad project, but maybe you'll get something out of it, but it just really wasn't for me. My worst track on the album is GNX. Number 2, Loss of Life by MGMT. I love MGMT, and their last album, Little Dark Age, is one of my favourite albums of all time. So when they announced a new album, I was ungodly excited, but when I listened to the first single, Mother Nature, it was just fine. But I thought maybe it was just a bad single, you know? And then I listened to the full album, and sadly my fears came true. I didn't really like it at all. It feels like someone tried to make a really diluted version of Ween's album, Quebec, and even that might be giving it too much praise. On their last album, MGMT mixed goth rock, post-punk, and 80s industrial pop together with their own signature style to create an album inspired by the past, but that felt really new and refreshing at the same time. On this album, they tried to do a similar thing, I guess, with 70s rock, blues rock, and a bit of prog rock, but this time the creativity and the execution just aren't there, so it sounds like a bunch of forgotten rock songs from the 70s that were too dull to even be remembered. Everything from the lyrics to the instrumentals just fall flat and are super uninteresting. Just so disappointed coming from such a talented band. Worst track, Bubblegum Dog. And finally, on to number 1 of the worst albums of the year, Vultures Number 1 by Kanye West and Ty Dolla $ign. Where do we even begin with this one? Kanye spent this entire year saying the worst things imaginable, so going into this album we already had that massive baggage. And then when we got to the actual album, it ended up sounding like a really racist 8-year-old got let near Fruit Loops and a decent mic. The whole thing just sounds impressively amateur, which is astounding knowing this comes from someone who used to be one of the most talented rappers and producers in the genre. If Kanye isn't screaming bad half-baked lyrics, he's repeating bad samples over and over again, such as on the song Back to Me, where he samples a quote from one of my favourite movies, Dogma, to the point where it becomes ungodly aggravating. And when he's not doing that, he's using his album's collab artist, Ty Dolla $ign, as well as all the other featured guests, to do all the work for him. And even then, they sound like they really don't care and would rather be anywhere else. The only artist on this album that seems to be giving it their full is Kanye's young daughter North on her one verse on the album. And if you're literally all getting beat by like a 10-year-old, you really gotta rethink your life, guys. An abysmal album, and apparently the sequel is worse, but I literally didn't have the strength to listen to it. The worst track is King or Hood Rat. Both of these tracks are fucking awful, and yeah, not good. Right, now that we've gone past the bad, it's time to move on to the good, and by golly was there a lot of good. So much so that it was actually hard to like narrow it down to just 5 albums, but you know, I did have to. And again, I gotta say, these 5 albums are so good that, whew, amazing is all I can say. Number 5, Chromacopia by Tyler the Creator. Tyler has just really never stopped hitting it out of the park, and is pretty much one of the best rappers of his generation in my opinion. And on this album, we get his most personal work yet. Tyler, like another rapper a few years back, Kendrick, using this album as a pseudo-therapy session to discuss his deep personal issues with commitment, getting older, and his relationship with both of his parents. And while maybe that isn't entirely new territory for Tyler, on this album he goes in more depth on these topics than ever before, creating an amazing listen that not only gets us into Tyler's psyche, but is also catchy to boot. There's also a revelation right at the end of the album which I literally think puts the rest of Tyler's discography into a new context, so that's interesting. As well as this, it features some of Tyler's most lush beats and instrumentals, featuring a lot more of a soul and psychedelic funk-inspired sound, especially in part due to the collaborator Thundercat. These songs will make you want to dance and cry all at the same time. A great mature album from the rapper, and I really can't wait to see what he brings to the table next. Favourite track, Balloons. Number 4, Last Will and Testament by Opeth. I'm a big Opeth fan, but I feel like most people, I won't act like the last 4 albums haven't been a bit lacking for me. What originally was meant to be an experiment, trying to make an album that sounded like their prog influences, turned into 4 very samey sounding albums that all ended up sounding more like ripping off the classics instead of them putting their own sound into an old style. So when they announced this album would be a return to form, I was cautiously optimistic. But I can safely say that this is another great classic Opeth album, while still taking some influence from their last 4 albums, but in a good way this time. This album just aesthetically hits me in the right spot, with its concept feeling like some sort of Dickens-esque gothic story, detailing a story about a rich patriarch's will being read to his evil family, with each song corresponding with a chapter of his will and exposing the evil deeds of his family. While every song may not stand out so much on its own, as a whole listening experience, it feels like being absorbed into this spooky mansion for an hour, as I listen to some of the coolest dark instrumentals from Opeth and the return of Michael Ackerfeldt's haunting death metal growls. A big recommend, especially to Opeth fans that may have skipped the last few albums, as I really do think you'll get a lot out of this one. Number 3. Brat by Charlie XCX. Look, even if the album may have become oversaturated as all hell now, with every song from it becoming pretty much inescapable, that doesn't mean the album isn't a 10 out of 10. This album is absolutely amazing, and every song on it feels like it could be a hit single, while lyrically feeling like a very personal look at Charlie herself, which is quite an interesting dichotomy. The whole album feels like all the emotions processed on a drunken night out, going from confident and full of energy, to sad, to catty, to self-reflective, and just full on let yourself go partying towards the end. On top of this, it has some of the best production I've heard on any album ever. Every instrumental is a maximalist cacophony of the most brilliant sounds beamed directly to your ears, and they're so catchy you won't forget them anytime soon. It's the end of the year and I still haven't forgotten most of these songs. What else is there to really say? A fun yet introspective album from start to finish. Amazing stuff, Charlie, and I can't wait to see what you do next. Favourite track, 365. Number 2, The Rise and Fall of a Midwest Princess by Chappell Roan. This might be my most listened to album of the year, no joke. I listened to this album in full nearly 3 times straight on my first listen. And it astounds me this is a debut album, because it's very rare anyone hits out of the park this good on the first go. An extremely beautiful and emotional album dealing with Chappell Roan's own issues with her own lesbian relationships, her coming out, being proud as a queer woman, and how hard it was to do all of that coming from a religious Midwest background. And while I'm not a lesbian woman myself, as a queer person, I felt a really deep emotional connection to a lot of the lyrics. That comes down to how beautifully written they are, coming off like poetry times, such as on the songs like Kaleidoscope, which feels like this hauntingly sad poem written to her lover that seems to be drifting apart. But what's also great about this album is that it can balance these somber songs with these really upbeat, fun, queer dance anthems that I'm sure will play in clubs and bars for years to come. And instrumentally, it's just a really good balance of super high energy pop beats for the upbeat songs and extremely hauntingly beautiful strings for the more somber songs. A huge recommend to everyone, especially people looking for some pop music with a lot of creativity and emotion, which seems to be missing in a lot of artists today. Favourite track? Kaleidoscope. And finally, onto my favourite album of the year, and this one is, again, this one was one of those ones, the moment I listened to it, I knew it would be my favourite. Number 1, no title as of 13th of February 2024, 28,340 dead. Godspeed You Black Emperor. Godspeed You Black Emperor are one of those artists that the moment I heard one album, I had to listen to everything they made. A beautiful instrumental post-rock band who just through the use of song titles, samples, and most importantly their instruments, can create whole stories and images in your mind, unlike any other band I've known. And I'm glad to say that their newest album might be one of their very best. A very timely and political album, much like their others, but this time dealing with the Palestinian genocide at the hands of Israel. And I think due to this, it is one of the most important albums of the year. Using purely the artistic medium of music to represent the plight of the Palestinian people, while also showing the hope and fight these people have against an evil, oppressive regime, with songs making you feel the utter hopelessness and despair one minute, but then the next making you feel the strength of the Palestinians themselves and their ability to stay alive despite the odds the next. A truly beautiful album that isn't always easy to listen to. I gotta admit that every time I listen to this album full, I've cried, but it truly is an impressive piece of art with a great message behind it, and I think really that's why it is so amazing. It may not be easy to listen to, but like all great art pieces, it really makes me feel something, and it really just fills me with this just absolutely awe-inspiring feeling over me. Absolutely a 10 out of 10 album. Favourite track, Babies in a Thundercloud, an absolutely recommended listen from Comfy Pongo themselves. And that brings us to the end of the video, and again, I recommend if you're a big music fan and you haven't listened to any of the albums I mentioned, you give them a go, because they are just really amazing. And just overall, I'm really pleased with 2024. I think for both music and films, which I'll get into in the next video, it has just been a really great year for just art in general, especially music wise. We've just had a lot of really interesting stuff, and even like I've put on this list, a lot of it was pop music too, which really surprised me. There's been a lot of great pop coming out this last year, and just a lot of great music in general. So again, I really do recommend you give it a listen. And yeah, and with that, I hope you guys enjoy your weekend and have a really great rest of your day. If you like the video, remember to like the video. Subscribe if you want to see more videos similar to this one. Hit the bell notification so you get an update every time I upload a new video. And with that, guys, Comfy Pongo out.